attention, please. Welcome, everybody. So today we have Jerry Stroh, and he's going to talk about a life of control and making politics in the age of plasticity. And I also want to note that next week we're having here a colloquium on indigenous politics, so you're all welcome again. So now it's Jerry Stroh.
Great, thanks. So this is the next book project, which means that it's sort of a big landscape, meandering talk. So hopefully it'll at least provoke lots of questions. So the idea was, it was one of the chapters of the dissertation that ended up on the cutting room floor, in part because I realized it was book length, which is not a great chapter for one's dissertation, or at least if you want to finish and have a job, which I did, so I shouldn't finish. Which was to take seriously the early 40s and then continuing movement, which came to be called cybernetics, information theory, and a number of other ways of thinking about life in its full expanse as being reducible to information, as a serious part of the development of global politics, in particular instruments of foreign policy and domestic politics. Which is to say, to risk being, pigeonholed in the world of science fiction, but for which I think that there is actually a strong claim to be made that it wasn't just a kind of intellectual movement, but it became a formative part of the way that we organize politics, and in what I try to argue in the book, try to escape politics, which is to say that the ability to think that we could design the world and somehow produce the very constituents we wanted of the world, just to say we could actually build components that would be in it, people, to be predisposed to certain kinds of political agendas, led to a kind of meta-politics, which is to say a way of doing politics without conflict. And so in the book, I'm trying to work through the different ways that I think that played out, both theoretically, in thinking about different kinds of interventions and what we're now calling neuroplasticity, but then on larger scales, everything from nation building to geoengineering. So I'm going to work through the chapters and see sort of what we think. So what do we mean by plasticity? In 1870, the guy who figured out magnetic fields, I think one of the early founders of complexity theory, said, "The only laws of matter are those which our minds must fabricate, and the only laws of mind are fabricated by matter." Nearly 130 years later, Catherine Malibu writes, "The brain that changes itself," this recent book's title expresses, via neuroplasticity, the very situation of the philosopher today. A brain that changes itself, that is exactly what I am. Which is to say that plasticity doesn't mean elasticity. It's defined precisely by the ability to change, but change within limits that can't be returned to. So every mutation of a plastic system always bears the mark of its inability to return to what it was. So it's a kind of conflict, right? Because it's both a limit and a horizon. And so the brain becomes sort of the predominant model. We have Ashby's Design for a Brain being one of the earliest cybernetic texts. We're trying to think through thought as if it were a kind of model for the larger plastic world. So the next structure was to think about whether or not the brain was a computer. So we have this sort of plasticity of the brain, which gets expanded to the social, and then we have an attempt to try to reduce the brain, according to many, to also information. And so Turing and Newman developed the concept of universal computing. Basically, Turing sees a lecture that von Neumann gave. Turing figures it out and develops the Turing machine. But basically the idea that thought isn't actually complex, or to say it's not complicated. It becomes complex because of a number of relatively simple computations being run at the same time and stacked on one another. So this sort of Enlightenment idea that we have these beautifully full-crafted ideas all at once that come down or descend upon us is broken up into instead millions of steps. So the basic conclusion of Turing and Newman is that if it is a million sort of simple steps, then there's no reason why the human brain in some way would exceed a machine. Which is to say we could have a machine brain, and functionally therefore our brain was a machine. So neurological processes are numerous but not complicated, and that the brain-body network is fundamentally an information system. Which is to say, if we combine that insight with the insight of plasticity, then we have a kind of series of concentric circles of information systems that can change. They can't change infinitely, and they always bear the mark of having been changed, but there is the possibility of alteration. right? So we have a fundamentally different theory of human nature, right? This isn't one where we have particular capacities, they're either the result of evolution or God, and we're stuck with them. They can actually be altered, and they can either be altered sort of internally, the way that Catherine Malibu thinks about plasticity, or there's the possibility of sort of hacking the system and getting inside the overlaying concentric information systems that would alter it. So I sort of work through those problems and really what that means. And then in chapter 2, start with the first two major theorists that make this a global politics project and not just a kind of history of cybernetics. Which is to say that the first way of trying to adapt these insights of complex systems with relative plasticity, which could be made information systems, was to try to theorize how it may give us new opportunities to exit anarchy. So right, we return to this old Hobbesian problem, but now instead of having the Leviathan, we can actually design our way out of it. And so we're going to talk about two people primarily, a guy named Jose Delgado, who founded the Yale neuroscience program, and a political scientist named Carl Deutsch, who was Norbert Wiener's best friend, who both, in their own way, tried to deal with it. Delgado, in his book, Physical Control of the Mind Towards a Psycho-Civilized Society, proposed a model for, in some sense, cheating politics. Although he did it in a way that I think now we'd find relatively unacceptable. Ethical is like, we're not even in the realm of ethics at this point in time. So Delgado was basically made famous because he performed a number of human experimentations in the United States at Yale, directly implanting electrodes into human brains as well as animal brains in order to do things like inhibit the hippocampus and other parts of the brain that he identified as being part of aggression control. This book did not come out in some sci-fi book series. This book series was, or this book was the immediate book after Heisenberg's Physics and Philosophy in the Penguin Great Thinkers series. This was a guy who was taken extraordinarily seriously. Right? In 1969, people thought that he really had something to say about politics. His basic thesis was that human evolution had stalled, that we had built our way out of competition with other species and material environments, but the problem with exiting from evolution is that that same exit from competition actually led to intensifying internal competition. Right? In IR, we call this the security dilemma. Right? This sort of techniques whereby we compete over other issues. And then as a result, if we didn't physically intervene in our own evolution, we were facing a kind of auto-suicide. Right? He's thinking about the atom bomb here. Right? So the sort of furthest extent we can think of kind of scientific development brought us to the brink of collapse. What you're watching now was the experiment that made him famous. It was called the Cordoba bull experiment. He basically took a bull that had notoriously killed a number of bullfighters in Spain, and you get to watch the bull chase after the bullfighter. And then he hooked up an electrode to the bull's brain and walked into the ring wearing nothing but his lab coat and the remote control sensor. And brought the bull to its knees, for which then the bull stood up and walked around, and he could even scare it. For him, he had demonstrated that he had at least a significant enough understanding of the brain, right, with even the limited technology he had, to remove the aggression instinct he saw being at the heart of competition. And for him, this was the proposal of a new political alternative. We didn't need to worry about consensus. We didn't need to worry about coalition building. We didn't need to worry about better institutions. We could literally build the people which would want better institutions. Right? This is what I'm calling the kind of metapolitics. In the nerves of government, Carl Deutsch takes a less repulsive approach, which is to say he's not cutting open people's brains, but instead a kind of soft approach to plasticity. And so he tries to develop a theory of the organism, which he calls any sufficiently complex collectivity that has to have an information stream from the outside, right, to get to be able to view the world. You have to be able to recount or store that information. And the information stream has to have knowledge about itself. As a result, we could think of states, organizations, political parties, even individuals as a kind of mind in life, right? So the brain has the ability to self-steer, and that's as much true of an institution as it is of a body. That in some sense, that self-steering was dependent on plasticity, so the ability to learn and change, which is to say, we actually demonstrate the capability to evolve, right? We see that in institutions. And that if we could perfect selection abstraction, communication, recombination, and reapplication, then we could perfect politics. And so steering would be a kind of alternative to power, right? Rather than having competition between institutions, we could merely re-guide institutions and hope that when they bumped into one another, we'd have something like learning, right? Kind of institutional, individual, and political sort of education through interaction. The way we were going to come to know what we should steer for was to take the insights of Norbert Wiener about Brownian motion and apply them to what he called the eco-social, which is to say that there's nothing in the world that isn't information. And if that's true, then we ought to be able to deduce from that that politics is as much patterned the way that Brownian motion is. Right? The question, though, was how would we come to predict the behavioral responses at the level of complexity of human beings? For him, he thought that was just a matter of time. Right? That there'd be a kind of method convergence, right? We should spread out in the world, Tower of Babel style, postmodernism, positivism, everything, but they would ultimately end up in the same place because what we'd find is in this complexity a certain kind of order. And that as a result, we'd end up with a kind of impersonally confirmable knowledge. This is absolutely important, right? If we think about politics as fundamentally disagreement, right, this is a way to solve disagreement and therefore make politics in some sense irrelevant. Merely a question of tactic rather than a question of disagreement. For him, the only obstacle was what he called the pathology of power. So for him, power is the measured degree that an autonomous system doesn't learn. I think that's actually a pretty good definition of American power these days, right? The degree to which we're not willing to change. And that systems characterized by the exercise of power would be fundamentally unsustainable. So for him, unsustainability was also nuclear war. He was in exactly the same place that Delgado was. Right? If we didn't learn to exit anarchy through a fundamental modification of what we thought of as human nature, we were all going to die. Which is to say, in both cases, the work was elevated, right, to the importance of species survival, which I talk about in the book. It's being part of what someone like Michel Foucault calls biopolitics, but actually it becomes part of survival becoming the metric for which we determine whether or not politics is a good idea or a bad idea. And this leads to a kind of anthropocentrism, which is to say he reads the human back into the social order. Nature is reduced to interlocking probabilistic opportunities, and humans become basically interest-maximizing machines, which is to say when they're not plagued by power, they do what's best. And so if Parsons was wrong about functionalism, it was only because he was studying the wrong kinds of units. We could build them, right? We could build the turgid world of social functionalism if we could just learn to hack or intervene the right part of the social order. Which led to him what he referred to as a will to control, which sounds negative to us. But for him, control was a kind of optimization, right? That we could limit the degree to which we were competitive and maximize the degree to which we were cooperative, and that would lead to a kind of permanent, and this is the important part, biological change in the capacity of our understanding, learning, and reception, right? So this isn't just a kind of social learning argument. This is about the whole ecological order. The problem, though, is that for him, it required a metaphysical commitment to nature being uniform, which is to say, a presumption there was a kind of hidden order behind all things, for which humans could then be optimized to. And, in some sense, the other political problem, which is that hiding behind his functionalism was liberal democracy. Right? For him, the best learning, adaptive, plastic system was the American system, and therefore the American system wasn't just the best system because of US exceptionalism, the US was exceptional because we had the best system. Right? And the pathological systems aren't just dangerous, they actually threaten human survival. Right? One can already see the hidden geopolitics here. So the inability for a communist state to learn, the inability of a communist state to adapt, is precisely what's bringing us to the brink of nuclear extinction. Therefore, it's their plasticity problem, not ours. And therefore, the imperative has to be to replace power politics, which normally defines the international system, with what he comes to call control, right? Which is to say, a process of mutual optimization that occurs through the altering of the plastic units of human brains, which then can go out, right, and spread the joys of cybernetic democracy. So I take those two sort of models of how to escape politics and look at how they're actually implicated in contemporary nation building. right? So the kind of cybernetic turn in nation building happens a few months into the Iraq War. This is actually a map that was put on one of the many horrible PowerPoints, which hopefully this is not one of them, that was shown to troops in Afghanistan so they could understand the simplicity of what exactly it was they were doing. But similarly, this is that kind of map, right? Within each unit, there are individuals, which are constituted by groups of feedbacks and information systems that can be slightly steered or reorganized. Then there are institutions within those units, right? These green blocks are development organizations, which provide the necessity of roads, new education centers, which then feed back into making new kinds of people, right? New Afghanis and Iraqis that understand the brilliance of democracy, which then feed back into other types of surveillance, right? And they've tried to create a living thing, right, under Deutsch's understanding, which is to say, this process whereby the flow of information and the output of information can be retained, understood, and can learn. So turn the battlefield into a learning organism that can be steered by the direction of the United States military. That wasn't supposed to happen. So culture, nation, and state are treated as informatics, right? So we have this sort of flattening out of all these different realms. Development, strategic communication. If you didn't see the ad recently on our listserv, this is what they're looking for. This is what they want you to be a part of, which is to say propaganda efforts that aren't understood as propaganda, right? Which directly take part in an information system, not a knowledge system. Which is to say that there's some kind of one-to-one ratio between input and output, and there's no heuristic necessity, right? No mediation has to take place. Of course, for persuasion and incentives. But there's also a stick. So if it's true that learning occurs through kind of hacking the information system, you also have to be able to coerce or move and steer those things that don't fall into it. And so based on John Warden and John Boyd's EVO, or effects-based operations revolution in the Air Force, they applied the same kind of cybernetic dynamics about learning and steering to the use of air power. So fundamentally, the way of thinking behind drone warfare comes from this idea that force can be variably adjusted to coerce changes in behavior. This is not war, right? This is not, we're going to try to beat an enemy. This is, we're going to nudge just enough with just the right amount of force so those people who weren't effectively sort of plastically reorganized in education centers could be steered through fear or other kinds of motivating factors that are part of the human ecology decision making. So targets are rated both semiotically and materially, right? So you blow things up that have kind of significance to the social order that you're trying to involve yourself in, and you blow up things that are necessary for the survival of particular social orders. So you cut particularly recalcitrant areas off from food and water, you blow up infrastructure that makes them feel particularly isolated, or you create systems of dependence, and this is an explicit part of the strategy, whereby people would seek you out for help and therefore buy into this organic order that you've created for the battlefield. So we have what's called the ODA loop, which was developed by John Boyd, which is that we should empower all soldiers to be decision makers, and we should create a kind of metric rather than an order, right? So they should be goal-oriented soldiers, not mission-oriented soldiers, and they should recalibrate through their involvement in this organic order, right? This constant flow of information that would tell them a little more force, a little less force, a little more development, a little less education, and therefore make decisions, right? So the soldier becomes a kind of Swiss Army knife in the cybernetic order. The last and most recent stage, which has just been recently announced, not surprisingly the day after Obama was elected, is a kind of automated state, which is to say to remove the soldiers from the process. So that's a micro drone, if one hasn't seen one, that can both deliver a kill vehicle and do surveillance, which is to say maintain this constant process of information. Which is that we should replace the ODA loop with what's called disposition matrix. It's already a weird term. No the, no a, just disposition matrix. Disposition matrix is an effort to model that system that I showed you before, but take the human variable out of it. So you input in the disposition matrix a series of databases that involve how much money we've spent tracking down each terrorist, that then gets cross-referenced with the priority order of which terrorists are more dangerous, which then gets cross-referenced with a constantly updating real-time database about the relative accessibility of those targets. And then that gets flattened out, not just to be included in who we kill, but also who we re-educate, right, and where we do resources. The idea, if it doesn't seem clear, is to take what has already happened, which is Obama sort of devolving the power of drones to the CIA, out of the hands of the CIA and into the hands of the database. Right? The metric becomes the deciding factor on where drones are redeployed and what targets they acquire. So this is sort of the missing piece of the puzzle in earlier drone warfare. We already had what's called object recognition software, which is to say we could mathematically describe in space the difference between an AK-47 and a shovel. So drones had the ability to acquire particular targets and the difference. We didn't have a way for them to know why a target mattered. And this is that brain. Right? This is that decision-making process that can run multiple parallel computational sequences and therefore decide what couldn't be politically decided. So we have a seamless web of information, input and output, that updates mission parameters in real time, and therefore the decision-making calculus is not one of political judgment, the way we think of politics normally, but a kind of meta-politics of efficiency, flexibility, and success. In the next chapter, I look at something I'm calling earth hacking, from geopolitics to geoengineering. This is a cloud that an artist recently created inside a building to try to produce the sort of spatial effect of the Marguerite painting. Right? You walk into a room and there's a cloud. The technology is actually not so dissimilar from how we're trying to cheat the politics of climate change. Right? So here again, I see this kind of meta-politics playing out. Right? We can model the complex system of the Earth. We can understand the hydrolytic cycle. We can understand the effect of albedo, which is the color of our atmosphere, and therefore make subtle interventions, right? And don't worry, because if the intervention doesn't go well, there's a constant update of information, so you should be able to perfect it. To alter the actual temperature of the planet, right? To create what some people have called a human, right, thermostat for the entire Earth system. This is also not crazy. And by not crazy, I don't mean it's not crazy. I mean people are taking it very seriously. Extraordinarily wealthy investor was just discovered doing the largest iron seeding operation ever illegally on First Nations territory in Canada. The United Kingdom has already endorsed it as what they're calling Option Z, or the option of last resort, which is where they say we are. And China did it throughout the Olympics to create just the right lighting, which is to say just the right weather, so that they could shoot the whole thing. So what's wrong with that? That sounds great, right? You don't need cooperation, right? You don't need something like the Kyoto Protocols. You don't need to build a consensus about doing something about the planet. If you have the resources, just do it. The problem is that there's a massive uneven distribution of costs and benefits, right? In old school political science terms, politics. Right? So wealth and resources determine freedom of action. Right? Your ability to geoengineer the planet is directly proportional to the amount of money and the technological resources you have to do something like build a giant solar shield or change the color of clouds so that if they're a little more white, we can lower the temperature of the planet. Which again, seems fine, right? We're the people, to be perfectly honest, that have created the mass amount of carbon. Why shouldn't we bear the costs? The problem is that we don't bear the costs. As I think modeling is already demonstrating, if the US were to unilaterally take an albedo approach, which is to say change the color of the clouds, it would actually cause mass famine and desertification of tropical zones. So the problem is when you cool at the poles, which is to say closer to the United States and Europe, and at the other side, the antipode, Australia, you create dry bands around the middle of the planet, which is to say you exacerbate famine. Normally the way that we have checks on those kinds of global interventions is because we have the institution of politics. We can disagree. But in part, the attempt to design our way or engineer our way out of climate change makes it seem as if it's apolitical, right? Which is to say it's optimization. But in fact is hiding a kind of intensification and amplification of a colonial legacy. I say a variable settler colonial legacy because it may be one of the few times where American Indians and Aborigines get to free ride off of the benefit of the place that they live. Right? It might actually get cooler in the United States. But for indigenous people in South America and Central America and the tropical zones, they're likely to run out of food and water. So here's the upshot. We have these dreams of control and a kind of dream of authenticity, which is to say the only way that we've responded to these attempts to engineer the planet have been fundamentally around what I call somatic fundamentalists or human essentialists. We have people like Aldous Huxley, Hans Morgenthau, William Burroughs, Michel Foucault at times, and certainly Jürgen Habermas, who think that the way to get around the problem of metapolitics is to simply say that it's evil, right? Because that always works. And that the political strategy should merely be to accept humans as unalterable and therefore hold on to a kind of essential characteristic that can be used as a bulwark against these kinds of modifications. Probably the most succinct version of it came in Burroughs' The Limits of Control, which he argued that the control of information was the new train of power. The dream of people like Delgado is the dream of all governments. Of course you want to change your people, because wouldn't it be great if they all agreed with you? But that there is a contradiction at the heart of it. The control fundamentally requires resistance, something to be controlled. And as a result, if control ever eclipsed resistance, humans would die. They would literally not be able to function, because there's something about being human which is about being free. It's a nice idea. But here's the problem, I think, with the moralization approach. We're already engineering the planet. We are already engineering politics, we are already engineering war, and we're certainly already intervening in our brains. And to say that for the last 60 years we've been moralizing against these things has done nothing to slow the pace of them. And so the conclusion of the book is to say you can't escape politics, right? All of these sort of meta-politics that thought they could design their way out didn't. In fact, all they did was cover up power politics. So what we need is a kind of politics of design, which is to say we need to make the meta-politics that was hidden as optimization political. Or as Allenby has said, if we've always already been geoengineering from the time we first started the first fire to the first time we changed the color of a cloud, then we should figure out how to engineer better. Which is to say we should put it squarely within the political agenda such that it can be politicized. Right? So the process isn't one of moralizing against it, trying to hold tighter to this idea that we're really these enlightenment beings that can't change, that we're not plastic, because guess what? Neuroscience, they're winning that battle. But in fact, that we need to, on the left and for progressive politics, have our own politics of plasticity, which I say argue requires the insight that the world is complex but not complicated, which is to say that chance is an ontological, not epistemological category. It's fundamentally experimental. There is no mastering of the world, there's just intervention. The closure of systems is the death of politics, not power, right? Once you think that you've optimized, that's actually even under the sort of second order cybernetics definition of death, right? You stop receiving information. So we have to be open to new strategies. And that while we have to take the plasticity of systems as a fact, we have to constantly push against this idea that that gives us some new fulcrum against politics, right? Instead, understand that it actually is new kinds of institutional challenges for which we haven't designed institutions for at all. So that's the book in a nutshell. Thanks everybody for making it through all that. I'm hoping that means there are questions. Yeah.
So I thought this was really interesting, and I just was curious about some other parts of the social science literature that might fit into this, or hear your thoughts on this. I mean, what about the behavioral revolution in political science and behavioral economics, right? I mean, how does that is very much the same idea, right? How we get people to buy fewer Big Macs, or
it's not just the same idea; it's the same person, right? I mean, Carl Deutsch is the person who shows mathematically that behavioralism is something worth studying. But there are a few others: Joseph Brassenow, Barnett. Right, there are a couple of others, but they're all talking to Wiener. They're all interested in this sort of cybernetic insight. And it's all premised on this idea that there is something that one can turn into relatively quantifiable information. Which is to say that the social system isn't opaque at all, it's just complicated. And that's why I think the real importance to say, why isn't my politics a new behavioralism, is because I do think there's a real difference between complex and complicated. Right? So systems can be extraordinarily mappable and interconnected and have sort of transversal effects where you tweak one thing and this huge effect happens. You tweak a big thing and nothing happens. But that doesn't mean that it's modelable. And so for me, that's where politics and ethics come in. Right? We're going to be taking chances. Right? This idea that we can optimize ahead of time or we can make people buy fewer Big Macs. buys into a notion of homeostasis that I don't think is here. But yeah, it's for me, and part of the book, I mean, this is Lippmann forward, right?
Right. So you intend this to be as a critique of that as much as, you know, the more shocking defense things.
Yes, but a critique that doesn't fall into the post-structuralist trap of saying that the problem was there was no truth, there was no world out there, it's all heuristics all the way down, right? There is a real material, complex organizational world which we grapple with all the time. It just is harder to grapple with than they thought.
Going back to the guy on the board here, what parallels can you draw, say, between propaganda and media censorship or sensationalism with social control?
Direct, which is to say, I think the best thing that Aldous Huxley ever wrote was actually not a novel. It was The Brave New World Revisited, in which he detailed the degree to which he thought propaganda was advancing much faster than politics. Which is to say, modern media techniques to address you on affective or emotional levels, combined with ways of getting information in through new means of perception, combined with then holding together kind of master messages, which could lead to state interests. If these are all organic systems, then the difference between putting a chip in your head and Fox News getting really good at what they do is not a difference, because plasticity, right, stretches beyond particular structures.
Well, to me this sounds a lot like Leslie White. He's an anthropologist that uses unilineal evolutionism to talk about how humans' use of technology is basically the different measures of how they advance evolutionarily. But what I'm wondering about now is what I perceive to be a current in our society is this kind of wish to step back. And, you know, this whole like DIY, green lifestyle, primitivism, this sort of thing. So how does that sort of fit into your idea of like there are other people that are modeling this in a stage way, but then there are some people that are trying to have that elastic kind of relationship to it. They are trying to return to some original.
But the return part is what makes them, for me, somatic fundamentalists, right? That there is this body, and it used to do things like the paleo diet. And if we could just get back to the way that humans were meant to eat, right, we'd be perfect. Or if we could just get back to the pre-agrarian revolution era, in which we were basically hunter and gatherers, and let's put it honestly, 9/10 of the planet died off, right? We would be in this kind of homeostatic relationship with the Earth. I think the important insight of plasticity is there's no going back, right? When a system changes, it's like a protein that denatures, right? You can make Jell-O and it'll harden, but when Jell-O melts, you can't cool it back off and make it solid again, right? There's actually a structural change in the organization of Jell-O that can't go back. We're Jell-O. We can change states, change structures, but there's no going back. You in the back, whose name I should know.
Josh. How does your book confront the rising popularity of the Nate Silvers of the world and people with increasingly large, enormous databases on human behavior that are apparently becoming more and more likely at predicting and anticipating human behavior? It seems like they're having some success.
Well, that's not surprising from the point of the book. The question is what we do with it, right? So this is part of the problem with behavioralism is that it has the first order cybernetics insight, which is to say systems can be modeled, but not the second order insight that systems have feedbacks across open systems. So, you know, the question is not like, great, Nate Silver was right, which makes him a really good version of the person at the circus who guesses your weight. What's the meaning of that guess, right? What does it mean that, for instance, the current political order is so stable that the other person who could have predicted the outcome of the election was Abraham Lincoln, right? Map the current electoral map onto the secessionism map and the conflicted slave states. Not a big difference, right? So the question there is the stability question. Why do we have so much stability in the political order at this particular moment? I don't think it's the behavioralist question that suddenly they got it right. Because what Nate Silver didn't do was tell Romney how he could win, right? Which was, in what ways could he alter the system so that that outcome wasn't set? Because even Nate Silver, right, he doesn't believe in fate. It's not like he thinks that he's a seer. He thinks that given a particular momentum, right, he has a probabilistic view of ...
I guess I have a question about when you're talking about the desire for mastery and control to create a sort of vertical world of life. And I was curious with, particularly with like military technologies, while there's this discourse or language or desire to control and to target specific individuals, say, so-called terrorists, so many wind up being, say, in Pakistan, Iraq, Afghanistan, civilians, and how is it that plays in, I guess, to the chances and the probability, but also sometimes the strategic violence through these different instrumentalities that don't always, that are controlling, but,
But I mean, part of this book is about the dark side of new materialism, right? When we understand things as systems, or we understand them as highly interconnected wholes, we lose a lot of individuality. Which is to say, from an effects-based organization or effects-based outcome standard of air power, those casualties in Pakistan only matter if they register in the feedbacks that are to measure relative popularity of the US military with Afghanistan. So for them, and this is what the people who are running disposition matrix will tell you, we had a bad disposition matrix, right? So we allowed for sloppy predator drones to go out and keep killing civilians, and then we'd better been having this sort of information input that's showing its relationship to insurgency, showing its relationship to lack of cooperation, doing basically better polling of Afghanis along the way. We would have been more careful about our target acquisition. But of course that problem, right, is humans are purely utilitarian resources at that point in time. They are only valuable insofar as they're measured against what organizes that new brain organism called disposition matrix, which is reduction in the number of people we call terrorists, increase in the level of cooperation, and then horizontal distribution of development, education, institutionalization. So, yeah. Total objectification, right? Like seamless objectification, which is terrifying.
So just thinking about, I think, this reversal, because you're talking about Fox News and this sort of, let's say, Judeo-Christian evangelical sort of ethos, right? From their perspective, the world is complicated, but it isn't complex, which is to say, like, there is going to be one world, right? And we can clearly delineate that, right? There's a certain project to bring about the second coming, which didn't happen on Tuesday, but, like, ultimately, I think then there has to be some cosmology, right? Some counter-resonance machine to go along with this, not simply calling for a politics of plasticity, but I think transition right from a being sort of ontology to a becoming. So how do you see the strategies of the political framing with the ontology and the cosmology such that it's inviting to Karl Rove? if that's the audience.
Okay, well, I think two things. The first is that I think Conley's theory of the resonance machine overestimates, and I think he thinks this now too, overestimates the degree to which the evangelical part of the resonance machine had any role in setting the agenda. In fact, part of the reason why the Republicans have a harder time holding on to the evangelical part of the wing is they didn't follow through on abortion or prayer in schools or even really faith-based initiatives. They were kind of half-assing the Christianity. So certainly those elements, which by the way are bipartisan, right? This sort of turn in warfare and turn in climate change is like this new broad middle, right? It's the attempt to create the new grand consensus after the Cold War. This isn't politics anymore, right? This is the definition of liberal democracy. It's just the process. The second part of that is certainly this is the death of the soul, right? This is the view that humans are fundamentally moldable parts of larger systems. And so, yeah, I think this would be hard to sell to most evangelicals. I just don't think they care much. And in part it's because so much of the design can be going on totally under the level of what we traditionally call sort of the discourse of politics. And this is one of the reasons why, for me, if I want to understand security, I can't just take a discursive approach. Because the discursive practices of security are important for forming kind of semiotically what we understand as danger. But they don't actually have a tight relationship to the way that we organize practice. Which is to say there's lots of different ways we can go after terrorists. And the cybernetic way is a very particular one that has particular political kinds of implications for what our institutions can do. And, you know, isn't caused by a discourse of danger. Even though a discourse of danger helps make it work in the world, if that makes sense.
Okay, so you've mentioned a lot of the kind of dark ways that this is going, so the kind of the Matrix tells the drone who to kill sort of thing, or even the kind of...
Who and when?
The kind of individual trying to take climate control, at least over his own house, into his own hands to make it work for him, sort of thing. But you also seem to be getting towards the end of the presentation, this idea of the insights we were putting out there. So new challenges for institutional control, allowing plasticity, keeping the system open. What are some ways that you see this already happening perhaps in a positive direction, or ways that you think it could happen? So obviously lots of scary things, but are there things that are maybe not scary, but not hard?
I think a relatively easy example. It drives me crazy when vegans and vegetarians say that we were evolved to be vegan and vegetarian. Because I think it absolutely undercuts the ethical weight of becoming vegan and vegetarian. I think you actually have to alter the rhythms of your body to not eat meat. Precisely because we were dependent upon certain kinds of high-impact proteins and very calorie-dense food. But that's great, right? It leaves a substantially smaller agricultural impact. It has all sorts of effects on the petroleum market, right? So I think there are ways to alter ourselves, right, at the individual level. I think that also occurs, right, politically, right? We learn to become open to gay rights, right? Gay rights doesn't make a persuasive argument and suddenly we're like, oh yeah, I get that, right? There has to be some more complex habitual process whereby we encounter something that defers our expectations just long enough that we have to think differently. But if we think thinking's embodied, then that's a whole series of practices for which some people decide ahead of time or by chance and then internalize those processes. So I don't want to make this distinction between like what we eat and what we think, because the whole point is eat, think, right? It's all flattened out. So we have to figure out new ways to intervene. And you know, Nate Silver's one of them, right? Nate Silver wasn't powerful because he got the numbers right, because we didn't know that until the end. He was powerful because he created a particular way of understanding these events and thinking about the space of politics that resonated at a particular moment when we were really tired of being told that science didn't work, math didn't work, right? Apparently now math is feminized. This is great. Right? All the Republicans are talking about how Nate's like mamby-pamby, he doesn't get into the world of judgment and politics, it's all numbers. Best thing could have ever happened, I think. We should all be feminine.
Do you think there's more need for nations to adapt to new situations if you said propaganda is getting much better and we've been able to predict outcomes like with the Nate Silvers? I mean, do you think that governments are going to adapt less, or they're just going to improve their methods more?
Okay, well there's an efficacy claim there and a prediction claim there. I don't do very well at predictions, but I'll try at efficacy. We got to get over this idea that persuading and altering the system is always propaganda. There's better and worse propaganda. You know what's propaganda? Telling people they should wash their hands. You know what's really good at slowing down the flu season? People washing their hands. Right? So I think that there are better and worse ways to intervene in the social. The problem is that it's political. Right? So I'd be perfectly happy if the propaganda was progressive. And I think part of the fear of the left is thinking that propaganda somehow violates this, you know, this line like, oh no, because you'll destroy reason, and if we're not reasoned individuals, we're not individuals anymore. We're not reasoned individuals, right? We're stacks of meat that do interesting things because we interact with one another. So my question is, how do we make those interventions, right, those objectifications that we don't like, better? Not how do we stop doing them, right? We're not going to ban propaganda. I mean, all of marketing is propaganda. We just need to market better stuff, right? You know, less Britney Spears, more figuring out how to work this thing out.
I very much appreciate your example of climate, global climate disruption and such, and the whole role of engineering in that. And it takes me back to some ancient writings like America by Design, but also Marcuse and others. Of course. And goes to, I very much appreciate you sort of end towards intervention, because I think that is a kind of critical juncture here. Now, how do you deal with, I guess what I perceive as, at least in the U.S., this political order that seems to have, I don't know, an inherent inability to deal with the politics of science? That, I can think of lots of legislative forums where there's a push, to try to bring that in to act as intervention, and the push is to put that back in the lap of certain experts without understanding sort of political ramifications of that. So just, your thoughts on that.
Yeah, and maybe in reverse order. So the left tried to fix climate change by putting Al Gore in front of a PowerPoint presentation. The right did it in every Sunday school classroom, every dinner table, every cultural transaction and interchange they could get their hands on. which shows in some sense that the right has been extraordinarily more adept at understanding how information becomes knowledge, right? Which I think the left's got to get on top of, right? We should be thinking about school board elections, we should be thinking about textbooks, but we should also be thinking about new ways to make climate change fun, right? They've made apocalypse sexy. We've made climate change boring. And that's because we think that the best way to persuade people is like a better argument. But there's a condition of possibility for a better argument and why it resonates, and that's all of this stuff. So we got to get better at that stuff. The last thing I'll say though is, like, Essay on Liberation is one of my favorite things Marcuse ever wrote. And he was not opposed, right, to this new relationship with technics. He doesn't have the kind of Heideggerian pessimism, nor a kind of Marxist pessimism necessarily about the way that machines alienate people. And his answer is joy, right? So if the right-wing version of this works off of resentment and fear, then we got to figure out a way to fold joy into remaking ourselves for climate. So that's honestly.
I'm just trying to figure out, where does that leave the role of experts?
Kill them all. No. In terms of who gets to speak,
Right.
in regards to, there's this great Michel Foucault line which no one ever talks about because no one ever reads the Archaeology of Medicine because it's really boring. But towards the end, he's like, we should all be our own best doctors, because who should ever know our body better than ourselves? Which is to say, I think it puts the onus of us all having to be extraordinarily more expert. Part of the conclusion actually addresses this debate that happens between Lippmann and Dewey on the public and its problems, which is the world's getting a lot more complicated, and democratic citizenship is premised on being informed, but isn't very good at actually producing people who can be experts on their own bodies, their own communities, their own global geoengineered systems. And if we're serious about democracy, then we have to make the wager that they could be. And so I think it means not less expertise, but more expertise. Right? The opposite of the Republican approach, which is to say we should have this sort of culture of doubt. We should have a sort of culture of intense curiosity if we want to be serious about new experts. Which I think you're seeing, right? There are people in the humanities talking about neuroscience, and they don't always get it right, but at least they're looking. Right? There are people in neuroscience who are like, hey, this Descartes guy was an idiot. They're not great at philosophy, but they're onto something, right? So I think what Conley calls role experimentation is extraordinarily important. We've got to put ourselves in the position of an engineer and try it out, even if we're not great engineers, and vice versa. I think it's where the change leads. That's like another book. I hope. Yeah.
I have a question that I'm not sure I can make it make sense. So I get from the chapters, first of all, it's a really interesting sort of combination of these cybernetic systems approaches that have just kind of marched on, right? Possibly.
Despite being called dead, right?
Yeah,
fascinating
exactly. Which is super interesting. They're still, I mean, and they've actually restructured the world in ways that are incredibly powerful and political. Right? So there's all of that leading to this sort of totalizing system. Is that, I mean, or maybe not totalizing is the word, but it seems quite overwhelming at the very least. So maybe a little, and so I wonder then what the politics of design is.
Yeah.
Because and this is sort of rephrasing maybe it's just, at the end, is the moment of resistance in any of this, since clearly they won. It's at this point.
I don't think they won. I think they had a dream of totality, but what we end up with is an extraordinarily cluttered world. Not a total world. And there's lots of bits and pieces that have effects that we didn't expect to have, right? Facebook could be the best surveillance system in the world, but in fact sometimes it allows us to watch the government, right? Right. So I think this is the optimization versus complexity problem. If the world were complicated, they would have won, but instead they just got a really good head start. And so I think the more that we take seriously that the way that we're going to intervene in, say for instance, accountability is going to be things like anonymous, not through better laws. The way that we're going to deal with war is about building a world where war makes a lot less sense, not by outlawing it, right? Like I think there is an engineering agenda, or what I call a design agenda, because I think engineering is too much about optimization and not enough about experimentation, right? When you do design, you like build a thing and you see what it does. And if it works, you keep building it. And when it stops working, you build something else. So I don't think it's total. In fact, I think quite the opposite of what we're seeing. You know, for me in my first book, which I hope is done-ish, the IED is a great example of how total the system isn't, right? Which is to say, it works off of all the same organic networks that were supposed to be controlling Iraq, and it totally disrupted it. And it was mostly throwaway cell phones and old landlines. So, system's never total. I'm not willing to go the like Marxist Adornian approach where its exact opposite is hiding just below the surface and the tools we need are waiting for us. Because I don't think it necessarily has to end well. I hope it does, but it probably won't. Get in better though. Well, if I haven't worn you out, I haven't worn me out. Normally I'm the person who intervenes and steps in, but I have to be the model of plasticity. I have to change the system. So thank you, everybody. I really appreciate it. And come back next week. We're going to have a really exciting panel of graduate students who are doing work in Indigenous politics, and I hope for a lively conversation.